Summary: a world that pines for more genteel levels of competition?
Expanding on the earlier observation that institutional, national economies are in great flux, we conclude by arguing that hypercompetition theory faces much more existential challenges to its legitimacy. Hypercompetition is increasingly viewed by political observers not as a descriptive reality, but as the manifestation of economic worldviews that are being heavily scrutinized at both a national and global scale. Early descriptions of hypercompetition by Daveni himself dismissed the alternative models, the old, genteel, stable oligopolies that defined competition during the 20th century are rapidly restructuring, 72 with a sense of inevitability. Specifically, much of economic and management theory, and certainly hypercompetition, has been premised on a worldview that recognizes advantages to the spread of free market principles with its competitive back-and-forth parlays on a global scale. As argued by Bhagwati in his 2004 book, In Defense of Globalization, 73, many of the ills blamed on globalization in general do not distinguish between some of the positive, for example, free markets, versus negative, free flows of capital, practices, which are differentially regulated. At the time of that writing, though, the huge post-2007 recessionary developments had not occurred. Dialogue did not yet reflect the now current re-evaluation of the basic advantages of capitalism occurring in management theory, evidenced by the frequent critical use of the term in academic journals, for instance, as reflected in a recent article titled, U.S. Capitalism, a Tarnished Model? 74. Libertarians and conservatives have entered the fray to argue that current events make a strawman criticism of capitalism, noting that non-capitalist regulatory constraints are not without blame for the financial collapse of recent years. 75 The unsustainable debt obligations of the United States and Europe also endanger the legitimation of the hypercompetitive model. We will not take the side of one force or the other in the above controversy. What we will conclude with is the need for hypercompetition theory to become much more introspective on the implications of its tenets. In particular, performativity theory refers to the perspective that the theories we elaborate and advance not only describe phenomena, but act to frame behavior. Management theorists have often reflected a concern for how theory legitimates or promotes particular ethically questionable behavior, for example, assuming guile among players. 76, or advancing untested economic processes and systems overall. 77 Hypercompetition, with its acceptance of temporary advantage as the natural outcome of competitive markets, needs to recognize that the chaotic rise and fall of businesses accompanying such a temporary advantage paradigm is likely to engender populist resistance to the casualties of this constant change. Thus, whereas hypercompetition theory dismisses the genteel levels of competition of the past, in the throes of world recession and significant unemployment, movements increasingly hearken to calls for such gentility. These forces dismiss hypercompetition as a force for destruction. It is important that hypercompetition continues to reinforce the ethical downside of the alternative systems with extensive scas that often reflect monopolistic and oligopolistic practices. 78 But what is more needed in hypercompetition is a critical self-evaluation of its neutral stance on competitive interactions and temporary advantage. For instance, research has explicitly acknowledged how hypercompetitive parlays can lead to the Alice in Wonderland Red Queen effect, to run as fast as they can to stay in place, and twice as fast as that. 79, noting importantly that whereas rivalry reduces the final value of many competitive moves, the competitive moves still advance overall firm performance. 80 In the modern environment, hypercompetition cannot assume the luxury that its audience will see rising firm performance as worth running twice as fast. In summary, a full-throated defense of the creative aspects of temporary advantage is called for, rather than a nonchalant dismissal of its collateral destruction. Second, Hypercompetition must engage in an explicit critique to discriminate between when particular strategic interactions relate to firm performance, potentially only on a temporary basis, and when they relate to performance for a wider stakeholder community. Hypercompetition is a flashpoint because it embodies the fact that the optimal economic paradigm is not clear-cut. In a world with an SCA, a firm can self-actualize to the highest pinnacle of performance, and the rise of the learning and knowledge paradigms for successful firms clearly paralleled the good life we prescribe for individuals. Unfortunately, we have found that such an economy filled with stable performance champions was just as likely to be a world of collusion and power consistent with the skepticism of industrial organization, I/O, economics, and one denying societal members the best products at the best prices,